We are on chapter 8 of book 7. I have the windows open today because it's beautiful outside, and there are some cardinals out there who are going crazy. If you hear them in the background, that's what it is. All right, do you remember what happened at the end of chapter 7? They'd all gotten to the tower. The children were there, the king. They'd rescued Puzzle, and they'd rescued Jewel, and they had Poggin the dwarf with them. And they're enjoying a nice meal, and then all of a sudden it got dark and it got cold and something smelled like death, they said. And Jewel sees something and tells everybody to look, and it says all 6 of them saw, and over all their faces there came an expression of uttermost dismay. So let's see what that's all about, okay? Chapter 8, What News the Eagle Brought. In the shadow of the trees on the far side of the clearing, something was moving. It was gliding very slowly northward. At first glance, you might have mistaken it for smoke, but it was gray and you could see things through it. But the deathly smell was not the smell of smoke. Also, this thing kept its shape instead of billowing and curling as smoke would have done. It was roughly the shape of a man, but it had the head of a bird. Some bird of prey with a cruel curved beak. It had 4 arms, which it held high above its head, stretching them out northward as if it wanted to snatch all Narnia in its grip. And its fingers, all 20 of them, because it had 4 arms, were curved like its beak, and it had long pointed bird-like claws instead of nails. It floated on the grass instead of walking, and the grass seemed to wither beneath it. There's a picture of what it is. And you see how you can sort of see through it? You can see the trees through it. 4 arms, 20 claws, and the grass is withering or dying beneath it. See how it looks like it's burning up beneath it? After one look at it, Puzzle gave a screaming bray and darted into the tower. And Jill, who was no coward, as you know, hid her face in her hands to shut out the sight of it. The others watched it for perhaps a minute until it streamed away into the thicker trees on their right and disappeared. Then the sun came out again, and the birds once more began to sing. Everyone started breathing properly again, and they moved. They had all been as still as statues while it was in sight. "What was it?" said Eustace in a whisper. "I have seen it once before," said Tyrion, "but that time it was carved in stone, and it was overlaid with gold, and it had solid diamonds for eyes. It was when I was no older than thou, and had gone as a guest to the Tisrock's court in Tashbaan. He took me into the great temple of Tash, or Tash." We probably should say Tash because I say Tashbaan, but I would like to call him Tash because he's like trash, but we'll call him Tash. And there I saw it, carved above the altar. "Then that thing was Tash?" said Eustace. But instead of answering him, Tyrion slipped his arm behind Jill's shoulders and said, "How is it with you, lady?" "All right," said Jill, taking her hands away from her pale face and trying to smile. "I'm all right. It only made me feel a little sick for a moment." "It seems then," said the unicorn, "that there is a real Tash after all." "Yes," said Poggin the dwarf, "and this fool of an ape who didn't believe in Tash will get more than he has bargained for. He called for Tash. Tash has come." "Where has the thing gone to?" said Jill. "North into the heart of Narnia," said Tyrion. "It has come to dwell among us. They have called it, and it has come." "Oh," chuckled the dwarf, rubbing his hairy hands together. "It will be a surprise for the ape. People shouldn't call for demons unless they really mean what they say." "Who knows if Tash will be visible to the ape?" said Jewel. "Where's Puzzle gone to?" said Eustace. They all shouted out Puzzle's name, and Jill went round to the other side of the tower to see if he'd gone there. They were quite tired of looking for him when at last his large gray head peered cautiously out of the doorway and said, "Has it gone away?" And when at last they got him to come out of the tower, he was shivering the way that a dog shivers before a thunderstorm because of how afraid he is of the weather. "I see now," said Puzzle, "that I really have been a very bad donkey. I ought never to have listened to Shift. I never thought things like this would begin to happen." "If you'd spent less time saying you weren't clever and more time trying to be as clever as you could," began Eustace, but Jill interrupted him. "Oh, leave poor Puzzle alone," she said. "It was all a mistake, wasn't it, Puzzle dear?" And she kissed him on the nose. Remember that a horse nose and a donkey nose, they feel like velvet. They're very soft and wonderful. So it's not like she's kissing this old, wrinkly, stiff, gross nose. But still, it is a nose of a donkey, and who knows where it had been down in the ground, sniffing things, picking up grass. Though they were rather shaken by what they had seen, the whole party now sat down again and went on with their talk. Jewel had little to tell them. While he was a prisoner, he had spent nearly all of his time tied up at the back of the stable, and he had, of course, heard none of the enemy's plans. He'd been kicked, and he'd done some kicking back, too. And he'd been beaten and threatened with death unless he would say that he believed it was Aslan who was brought out and shown to them by firelight every night, which he wouldn't do. In fact, he was going to be executed this very morning if he hadn't been rescued. He didn't know what had happened to the lamb. So they must have asked him, "Do you know what happened to the lamb?" Remember, on the one night they were there, the lamb, the young little lamb, was the one who bravely asked a question about who Aslan was and why they couldn't talk to him. And in some ways, he was braver than everybody and smarter than everybody because he just said what he knew to be true. But nobody knew what happened to the lamb. The question they had to decide now was whether they would go to Stable Hill again that very night, show Puzzle to the Narnians, and try to make them see how they'd been tricked, or whether they should steal away eastward to meet the help which Runewit the centaur was bringing up from Cair Paravel, and then return against the ape and the Calormans in force. Tyrion would very much like to have followed the first plan, because he hated the idea of leaving the ape to bully his people one moment longer than need be. On the other hand, the way the dwarfs had behaved last night was a warning. Apparently, one couldn't be sure how people would take it, even if he showed them Puzzle. And there were the Calorman soldiers to be reckoned with. Poggin thought that there were about 30 of them. Tyrion felt sure that if the Narnians all rallied to his side, he and Jewel and the children and Poggin, Puzzle didn't count for much, so he didn't include him, would have a good chance of beating them. Puzzle didn't count not because he's not important, he is, but he doesn't count as someone who could fight. He wasn't really made for fighting. But what if half the Narnians, including all the dwarfs, just sat and looked on? Or even worse, what if they fought against him? The risk was too great. And also there was the cloudy shape of Tash. What might it do? And then, as Poggin pointed out, there was no harm in leaving the ape to deal with his own difficulties for a day or two. He would have no Puzzle to bring out and show now. It wasn't easy to see what story he or Ginger could make up to explain that. If the beasts asked night after night to see Aslan, and no Aslan was brought out, surely even the simplest of them would begin to get suspicious. In the end, they all agreed that the best thing was to go off and try to meet Runewit. As soon as they decided this, it was wonderful how much more cheerful everyone became. I don't honestly think that this was because any of them was really afraid of a fight, except maybe Jill and Eustace. But I dare say that each of them, deep down inside, was very glad not to go any nearer, or at least not yet, to that horrible bird-headed thing, which, visible or invisible, was now probably haunting Stable Hill. Anyway, one always feels better when one has made up one's mind. Tyrion said they'd better remove their disguises, as they didn't want to be mistaken for Calormans, and then perhaps attacked by any loyal Narnians they might meet. The dwarf made up a horrid-looking mess of ashes from the hearth and grease out of the jar of grease which was kept for rubbing on swords and spearheads. Then they took off their Calorman armor and they went down to the stream. The nasty mixture made a lather just like soft soap. It was a pleasant, homely sight to see Tyrion and the two children kneeling beside the water, scrubbing the backs of their necks or puffing and blowing as they splashed the lather off. Then they went back to the tower with red, shiny faces, looking like people who have been given an extra good wash before a party. I don't know if that really happens today very much. They rearmed themselves in true Narnian style, with straight swords and 3-cornered shields. "Body of me," said Tyrion, "that is better. I feel a true man again." Puzzle begged very hard to have the lion skin taken off of him. He said it was too hot, and the way that it was all rubbed up on his back was uncomfortable. And also, it made him look so silly. But they told him that he would have to wear it a bit longer, for they still wanted to show him in that getup to the other beasts, even though they were now going to go meet Runewit first. What was left of the pigeon meat and rabbit meat wasn't worth bringing away, but they did take some biscuits. Then Tyrion locked the door of the tower, and that was the end of their stay there. It was a little after 2 in the afternoon when they set out, and it was the first really warm day of that spring. The young leaves seemed to be much further out than yesterday. The snowdrops were over, but they saw several primroses. The sunlight slanted through the trees. Birds sang, and always, though usually out of sight, there was the noise of running water. It was hard to think of horrible things like Tash. The children felt, this is really Narnia at last. Even Tyrion's heart grew lighter as he walked ahead of them, humming an old Narnian marching song which had the refrain, "Ho, rumble, 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 drumble, labored. Bum, 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 bum." After the king came Eustace and Poggin the dwarf. Poggin was telling Eustace the names of all the Narnian trees, birds, and plants which he didn't know already, and sometimes Eustace would tell him about English ones. After them came Puzzle, and after him, Jill and Jewel walked very close together. Jill had, as you might say, quite fallen in love with the unicorn. She thought, and she wasn't far wrong, that he was the shiningest, delicatest, most graceful animal she had ever met, and he was so gentle and soft of speech that, if you hadn't known, you would hardly have believed how fierce and terrible he could be in battle. Well, if I were there, I would be in the back walking with the unicorn too. I mean, when else is that going to happen? Of course she was with the unicorn. "Oh, this is nice," said Jill, "just walking along like this. I wish there could be more of this sort of adventure. It's a pity there's always so much happening in Narnia." But the unicorn explained to her that she was quite mistaken. He said that the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve were brought out of their own strange world into Narnia only at times when Narnia was stirred and upset. But she mustn't think it was always like that. In between their visits, there were hundreds and thousands of years when peaceful king followed peaceful king till you could hardly remember their names or count their numbers. And there was really hardly anything to put into the history books. And he went on to talk of the old queens and heroes whom she'd never heard of before. He spoke of Swan White the queen, who had lived before the days of the White Witch and the Great Winter, who was so beautiful that when she looked into any forest pool, the reflection of her face shone out of the water like a star by night for a year and a day afterward. I didn't know about her before. And then he spoke of Moonwood the hare, who had such ears that he could sit by Cauldron Pool under the thunder of the great waterfall, and he could hear what men spoke in whispers at Cair Paravel. He told how King Gale, who was 9th in descent from Frank, the first of all the kings, you know who he is, right? That's the cabbie from Magician's Nephew who became king. He told how King Gale had sailed far away into the eastern seas and delivered the Lone Islanders from a dragon, and how, in return, they had given him the Lone Islands to be part of the royal lands of Narnia forever. Okay, in one of the books we read, probably Voyage of the Dawn Treader, someone said, do you know how the Lone Islands came to belong to Narnia in the first place? And they said no, and I think the narrator said, if I ever find out, I will tell you. Am I remembering that right? He just told us how. King Gale went there and he delivered them from a dragon, and so they said, we will take you as our king. That's a good story. He talked of whole centuries in which all Narnia was so happy that notable dances and feasts and at most tournaments were the only things that could be remembered, and every day and week had been better than the last. And as he went on, the picture of all those happy years, all the thousands of them, piled up in Jill's mind till it was rather like looking down from a high hill onto a rich, lovely plain full of woods and waters and cornfields, which spread away and away till it got thin and misty from distance. And she said, I do hope we can soon settle the ape and get back to those good ordinary times. And then I hope they'll go on forever and ever and ever. Our world is going to have an end someday, but perhaps this one won't. Oh, Jewel, wouldn't it be lovely if Narnia just went on and on, like what you said it had been? Nay, sister, answered Jewel. All worlds draw to an end, except Aslan's own country. And Aslan told Diggory and Polly that in Magician's Nephew, when they were in the wood between the worlds, and the pool that they'd come out of was dry, that world was no more, and Aslan said, take note, beware, every world draws to an end. Well, at least, said Jill, I hope the end of this one is millions of millions of millions of years away. What are we stopping for? The king and Eustace and the dwarf were all staring up at the sky. Jill shuddered, remembering what horrors they had seen already. Tash, remember? But it was nothing of that sort this time. It was small, and it looked black against the blue. I dare swear, said the unicorn, from its flight, that is a talking bird. So think I, said the king. But is it a friend or a spy of the apes? To me, sire, said the dwarf, it has a look of Farsight, the eagle. Should we hide under the trees? Said Eustace. Nay, said Tyrion, best stand still as rocks. He would see us for certain if we moved. Look, said Jewel, he wheels, meaning he's flying around in circles. He has seen us already. He is coming down in wide circles. Arrow on string, lady, said Tyrion to Jill, but by no means shoot unless I bid you. He may be a friend. If one had known what was going to happen next, it would have been a treat to watch the grace and ease with which the huge bird glided down. He alighted on a rocky crag a few feet from Tyrion. He bowed his crested head, and he said in his strange eagle's voice, which I have no idea what that sounds like, Hail, King! Hail, Farsight, said Tyrion, and since you call me king, I may well believe you are not a follower of the ape and his false Aslan. I'm glad of your coming. Sire, said the eagle, when you have heard my news, you will be sorrier at my coming than of the greatest woe that ever befell you. Tyrion's heart seemed to stop beating at these words, but he set his teeth and said, Tell on. All right, here's Farsight the eagle. You can see Jewel, Tyrion, the children, and Poggin the dwarf. And look at Puzzle. Look at his donkey face sticking out from, because the lion skin is all twisted up on him. This kind of feels like the end of the last chapter where they said a look of utter dismay covered their faces. Farsight says, this is the greatest woe that ever befell you. 2 sights have I seen, said Farsight. One was Cair Paravel filled with dead Narnians and living Calormans. The Tisrock's banner advanced upon your royal battlements, and your subjects flying from the city, this way and that, into the woods. Cair Paravel was taken from the sea. 20 great ships of Calormen put in there in the dark of the night before last night. No one could speak. And the other sight, 5 leagues nearer than Cair Paravel, was Runwit the centaur lying dead with a Calormen arrow in his side. I was with him in his last hour, and he gave me this message to your majesty, to remember that all worlds draw to an end, and that noble death is a treasure which no one is too poor to buy. So, said the king after a long silence, Narnia is no more. There's Cair Paravel, and you can see the ships that came and took it. There is Runwit the centaur. He's been shot with a Calormen arrow, and he is dead. Narnia is no more, said the king. The land is still there, but enemies of Narnia have taken over the castle. They've taken over the woods. We'll see what happens next.